Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Renee Knake Jefferson. She is the co-author of a new book called Shortlisted, Women in the Shadows of the Supreme Court. Those of us wishing good health to Justice Ginsburg feel acutely now more than ever the importance of this subject. Renee is exploring here the stories of women going back even to the 1930s. Some of those stories hardly told and hardly known by most of us, who were considered for a seat on the Supreme Court but didn't make it. Of course, Sandra Day O'Connors became the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court in early years of President Reagan's presidency. And only four women have ever sat on the Supreme Court in the entire history of our country. But this is more than just about the Supreme Court. This is about the evolution of attitudes and progress in women gaining a fair share of positions in all sorts of leadership roles, deans of law schools, seats on the boards of major companies, positions as equity partners in major law firms. We have a long way to go. Renee actually wonders whether this period of isolation, when we are taking care of ourselves during the pandemic, and both men and women are exposed more and more to the importance of childcare and caring for loved ones during this health crisis, whether that may actually incidentally help to advance progress in attitudes that still need to be changed in order to allow women and minorities fuller access to positions on the bench, in academia, in roles of leadership in business. There's so much to talk about on this topic, and it's a fascinating conversation with Renee. I know you'll enjoy it. A really great book, which I've enjoyed reading. Stay tuned for this episode. Stay healthy, stay well, everybody, and enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. We are talking today about the Supreme Court and women justices to the Supreme Court, of which there have been pitifully few. And the topic is no more relevant than ever today, as news of Justice Ginsburg being in the hospital is facing us as we record this episode. So we send her our best wishes for a speedy recovery, and welcome our guest today, Renee Knake Jefferson, the co-author of a new book called Shortlisted, Women in the Shadows of the Supreme Court. So first of all, Renee, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I mentioned to you before we started that I've been very interested and have done a number of episodes over the life of our podcast on the Supreme Court, on changes in the Supreme Court and what impact that might have on Roe versus Wade. But your book, which is just out by New York University Press, is a fascinating look at an aspect of women's role in the Supreme Court, and I want to, perhaps if you could give us a little bit of your background and how you and your co-author, Hannah Brenner Johnson, came to write this book.
Sure. So Shortlisted, part of it unveils for the first time ever an untold history of the U.S. Supreme Court, and really an untold part of American history, in that it chronicles the lives and careers of 9 women who were officially shortlisted by presidents for a spot on the U.S. Supreme Court, going all the way back to the 1930s, before Sandra Day O'Connors, of course, became our first female Supreme Court justice in 1981. And each of those women had incredible legal careers before they rose to the level of even being considered for that ultimate pinnacle seat on the court. And so that's the first half of the book, is telling their story. And the second half then draws lessons from their lives that really have modern resonance today, as we try to understand why it is that women have been entering the legal profession, indeed all of professional life, in numbers relatively equal to men for decades, but we don't see that same gender parity across positions of leadership and power. And what we have deduced from studying these women who were shortlisted for the court is that there are some important lessons, things that they did, and also things that people who were charged with creating shortlists and importantly selecting who might come off them can do even now to help get to that remaining inequality and address it. How we came to this topic, we weren't really looking to research shortlisted women. We came to the topic, you might recall, when President Obama put forward the names of both now Justice Sotomayor and now Justice Kagan as his potential nominees. The media coverage was really focused on their appearance. Headlines after both of them wore similarly looking blue blazers to their confirmation hearings. Who wore it better? There's speculation about who would accompany them to fancy Supreme Court dinners, observations about whether or not they should have children if they were going to be sitting on the court or not, things like that. And my co-author, Hannah, and I, we were talking to each other, like, we didn't remember that same kind of coverage when Bush had, just a few years before that, nominated both now Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito. And so we did a media study looking at every article written by the New York Times and the Washington Post going back to the 70s through the confirmations of Kagan and Sotomayor. And well, surprise, surprise, the media study, every article published in the New York Times and the Washington Post on these nominees. And, surprise, surprise, we were able to show that indeed there was more gendered coverage for women nominees. But importantly, one of the articles that we found, written in 1971, was about Richard Nixon's shortlist. And there were two women on this shortlist. We had never heard of either of their names, Mildred Lilly and Sylvia Bacon. The article figured very much into the media study because it described California Judge Mildred Lilly as fortunately having no children and still maintaining a bathing duty figure in her 50s.
Unbelievable.
But for our purposes, with that fit into that media study. But then we were like, well, who are these women? And how many other women were considered by presidents before O'Connor for a seat on the Supreme Court? And that's what led us to do a lot of research to figure out that answer. And that's ultimately what led to the book.
Well, and the title of the book, Shortlisted, you actually give a definition about that word and talk about a couple of different layers of meaning to it, because of course on one level it just means you made the short list, but you ultimately weren't selected. But there's a deeper meaning, and I think it goes to, as you explain, why this isn't really just a story about women who didn't make it, who weren't ultimately selected. This is really a broader story about tokenism, about creating the appearance of diversity without the reality of diversity, and maybe with reference specifically to President Nixon, who you mentioned had two women on his quote short list. You could say something about that, because as you tell it in his private conversations, and Nixon is infamous for his private conversations, as we know, but he talks very, very candidly and disparagingly of the fact that he didn't really believe women should be on the court and should be in, frankly, any position in business or law. So help us understand what is that extra meaning or these extra meanings of the term shortlisted?
It's really a structural critique of, and in this case, the shortlist, but I think that there are a lot of different aspects of how we're trying to grapple with enduring inequality in positions of leadership and power for women and minorities. To this book is a structural critique of the device of the shortlist. As you point out, to be selected, you've got to be on that shortlist, and it's important, and it's of course you want to be on it, and yet what we found often in the women in the study, and you can see it playing out even now in the current efforts to fill positions of leadership and power, that this shortlist can become, on the one hand, an important way for someone to ascend, because you got to be on the shortlist to be selected, but it can also become a device for someone to say, yes, we care about equality and diversity. Look at this diverse array of candidates we selected. But if ultimately the individual who is chosen is a non-diverse person, then suddenly the an effort that could have been used to further efforts of diversity and inclusion becomes, maybe even inadvertently or sometimes deliberately, a device that preserves the status quo and undermines the very effort that it was being claimed to achieve. And as you point out, Nixon is for sure the most blatant example of this. He even says, when he's considering who to put, he had 2 vacancies at the time in 1971, and eventually they go to Justices Powell and eventually Chief Justice Rehnquist. But as he's considering candidates, he says, one of the other things he says in the Oval Office is, I don't even think women should be allowed to vote, but he wanted their vote. And he knew that by putting 2 women on the short list, he could then go out, and he did it. After ultimately 2 men are selected and confirmed, he goes out and gives a speech to a women's group and says, but look, we considered women, and that's a real step forward.
Mm-hmm.
And that we, again, it wasn't something that we necessarily set out to find, but it was really revealed through looking at how the shortlisting device has been used over time in the concept of the Supreme Court. It's a similar dynamic that happens anytime someone is being vetted for a position of leadership or power, whether we're talking about the Supreme Court, we're talking about coaches for professional sports, we're talking about the CEO for a corporation, an administrator in higher education, even the potential running mate for a president. Anytime a short list is crafted, these dynamics are present, and it's ultimately up to the people who are putting together the short list and selecting who comes off it to make sure that the short list is actually being used in a way that will further diversity rather than undermine it.
Well, and it's always, when you read the history and the evolution of attitudes, changes in social, cultural, gender attitudes over time. Here we are in the year 2020, and it's always shocking to think, wow, it wasn't really that long ago that we had such, by today's standards, such backward views. But that history is really important to understand. Obviously, we start with wonderful aspirations in the founding of our country, but it took until the first part of the 20th century for women even to get the right to vote. Women were not allowed into law schools. As recently, I think you cite, I think it's William and Mary that
Washington and Lee.
Washington and Lee that didn't allow women in until 1972. Women weren't allowed to practice law, a case that went to the United States Supreme Court and was affirmed based on views about the role that women should play versus men. But now, and since the first wave of the women's rights feminist movement in the modern era, in the 1970s, you can't say that there aren't qualified women lawyers, and yet we've only had 4 women on the Supreme Court. So there is this way in which that parallels other ways in which women have still a long way to go in terms of achieving leadership roles, as you point out, whether it's law school deans, seats on boards of directors of companies, and so on. And I mean, what are the lessons? And I want to get into some of the specifics of some of the women you profile. But what are the broader lessons, do you think, as we've traced that history and that evolution to where we are today?
Well, I think one of the big picture lessons that I came away with is how important it is to not continue to place additional burdens on women and minorities as they are trying to move into these positions of leadership and power. I think that there, in recent years especially, has been a lot of encouragement. You know, if you just dress a certain way, if you lean in, if you do this, if you find a mentor, and with so many hurdles and barriers already in place, one thing that came clear to me in studying all of the lives of the women in our shortlisted cohort, that adding more things on that to-do list isn't enough. And so what's an example of a structural change that doesn't burden women and minorities, but actually opens up the field to them? I'll give you a couple of examples, actually. So one comes from a president who doesn't make an appearance of having a short list with a woman on it in the book because he never had a vacancy on the Supreme Court during his term. That's President Jimmy Carter. Even so, he did more than any other president to literally change the face of the federal judiciary. He put more women in federal courts and lower courts, district courts and courts of appeals than any president before him. And the way he did it is this. He issued an executive order. He created judicial commissions around the country. Each of those commissions, the commissions themselves were diverse in their makeup. They had women and minorities on them. They were charged with looking for qualified candidates who were also women and or minorities. And as they vetted those candidates, they asked all of them questions about their commitment to diversity, equality, and inclusion. And from those commissions, that's how we ended up with significantly more women on the federal bench, a legacy that endures today. It's something that I think people don't remember from Carter, but should celebrate it. But importantly, on one of those commissions was a woman named Amalia Keirs. Amalia Keirs is one of the women in the study. She is the only African-American, the only minority woman to appear amongst those 9 who were considered before O'Connor. And we think that really is reflective of the additional barriers and burdens that female minorities face. The fact that there was only one minority woman in the study. And Judge Keirs, she was an extremely successful lawyer, first female African-American partner in a major law firm in Manhattan. And when she goes on one of the commissions, she's appointed to help vet candidates, and eventually she actually becomes one of the candidates who is selected, and it's through that commission process that she ended up on the Second Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. And so that to me is a real example of a structural reform that worked effectively. Now, someone might say, look, I'm not going to be president. I can't issue executive orders like that. What can I do? So I'll give you one more example of these kinds of structural reforms, also from a woman in the study. And this one comes from a woman named Soya Menchikoff. She was the first female law professor at Harvard Law School, the first female law professor at the University of Chicago, the first female permanent dean at the University of Miami, also the first female reporter for an American Law Institute, drafting what we all know now very well as the Uniform Commercial Code. And she also was the first female president of the Association of American Law Schools, the organization that all law schools belong to. And every year there's an annual conference that's held where law professors from across the country come together to do networking. And it's a place where you might have an opportunity to land a new job, that sort of thing. And she noticed when she became president that women were not attending. And she quickly learned the reason why, because the annual conference met over the holidays, the day after Christmas up to the New Year. In fact, the men would joke it was a chance to get out of the house when all the commotion was happening with, kids and family life. And so she moved the timing of the conference until after the holidays. Women could then participate. And in fact, I will tell you that Hannah and I, very early on in our academic career together, won a writing award at that conference. We were navigating raising infants, toddlers, now middle schoolers and high schoolers, and able to participate because she made that change decades ago. So structural changes like that are lessons that I think all of us can think about. Anyone who's in a leadership role can think about, what can I do to create an easier playing field for everyone to compete on, rather than putting more burdens on those who have historically been excluded from those leadership roles.
Well, I have to say, because you mentioned Judge Amalia Kearse, my sister, who went to Harvard Law School, clerked for Judge Kearse, and is now a dean of a law school in San Francisco. So she is one of the ones that made it. But you cite the fairly recent statistics that show, I mean, it's, the Supreme Court is such a rarefied membership. Only 4 women in the entire history of the Supreme Court made it to become justices of the court. But even now, when women are in equal numbers, if not more, in terms of graduates of law school, the numbers are still, really low in terms of being deans of law school, in terms of being equity partners in law firms, of being the in-house lawyer for major companies. There's got to be still some connection between the gendered media coverage that you started out focusing on when it comes to the way female Supreme Court justices, or female potential Supreme Court justices are talked about compared to their male counterparts, and the experience women have in other aspects of the life of the law and the life of business in this country. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, some people might say, oh, it's too simplistic to say that we're still dealing with sexism, but I mean that has to be a big part of the answer, isn't it, at this point?
Oh, I think that's right. And I guess I have a couple of observations about that. I mean, first of all, because the idea of a woman being in a position of leadership or power is still a relative novelty. I think that's part of why you do see media attention to traditionally, stereotypically female attributes. And then, of course, the particular woman who might be better at the moment is held up against whatever one would say as a stereotypical female. And that goes to sort of tokenism. So in the case of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connors was a wonderful Supreme Court justice, but very much was then held out as the measure for any other woman who would come along next. And so to the extent a woman who was going to be considered for the court didn't also have a lawyer husband, didn't also have children, hadn't also taken some time off to raise them, anything that deviated from that norm was considered unusual, even though women have all sorts of backgrounds and we're very diverse in our opinions, our viewpoints, and the way we live our lives. But because so few have been in positions of leadership and power, we become scrutinized in a way that men aren't. The other thing I will say with respect to your question about discrimination that endures. So in the study of the 9 women who were shortlisted, they were all very different in terms of their own political views and the way they ascended in their careers. And some of them were for the Equal Rights Amendment, some campaigned actively against it. We could talk all about that. But one thing that they all had in common was that they experienced outright, obvious, blatant discrimination. You cannot come to law school here because you are a woman. That was Florence Allen, for example. She was the woman who was first shortlisted by a president. She was considered in the 1930s by President Roosevelt. She started at the University of Chicago. She was the only woman there. She wanted to go to a school where there was at least, a couple more women. Her first choice was Columbia. Columbia was not letting women in at all. She ended up going to NYU. Every single one of the women struggled to find a job, even though they all graduated at the top of their class. And it wasn't just, sort of a soft, like, oh, sorry, we're not hiring right now. It was outright like, comments like this, looking at someone's resume and saying, oh, if only you were a man, or, we would love to hire you, but I'm sorry, we don't have separate facilities here for women. And so we have moved into a world where now, fortunately, the workplace has facilities to accommodate women. And we have many of the women who were shortlisted to thank for that. I mean, to go back to Florence Allen again, she was the first woman elected to the Ohio Supreme Court. She accomplished that because she had been very active in the suffrage movement. So she went out and convinced women, worked with them to get the right to vote, and then they voted for her once they could vote.
Right, because that was an elected position on the bench.
Exactly. Yeah. So she goes to the Supreme Court of Ohio, and then FDR puts her on the Sixth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. And when she arrived, and there was literally not a bathroom in the courthouse for her. She had to use one of the men's rooms until they could get federal funding to, build her a bathroom. And so we aren't in a world now where discrimination is that obvious. And in some ways and in many ways, that's obviously something to celebrate. And yet a lot of the discrimination that endures, because it's less obvious, it's harder to get at. And it often comes masked or wrapped up in an effort or an initiative that, at least on the surface, looks like it's designed to combat discrimination, but instead perpetuates it. And sometimes that's what happens with the shortlist.
Well, I mean, there has been that change. I mean, you could say the same thing largely about racial discrimination in this country. There are things that you just wouldn't get away with saying openly and publicly today, although some people still do. That not that long ago you would say out loud. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg talks about meeting the dean of Harvard Law School when she entered, along with only a handful of other women, and the dean said to them as a group, let's go around the room and you tell me why you deserve to take a man's place here in the law school. I mean, it's almost unimaginable that someone would say that out loud today, but there are all sorts of other more subtle forms of discrimination. I think the things that you uncovered about the way the media covers men and women differently really speaks to that. There are things you would point out about a female candidate that you would never point. You don't talk about what kind of shoes a man is wearing, or how do they look in a bathing suit, or how are they going to care for their children if they're appointed to a position of responsibility. I mean, you just don't ask those questions of men the same way. Even today, we still ask those questions about women.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the childcare piece is something that also figured prominently in the lives of the shortlisted women. So some of them chose not to have children. In fact, one, Susie Sharp, who was the first justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court, and then the first elected chief justice of any state Supreme Court in North Carolina, she would say publicly in speeches that she believed women had to make a choice, and you could choose to have your career and let that fulfill you, or you could choose to have children. You couldn't have both. But there are other women who absolutely did have both. So Carla Hills, who was considered by President Ford for the Supreme Court, she was his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And when she went to D.C. to take on the HUD role, she had 4 children in tow, and one was quite young, like still maybe 4 years old, holding her hand as she's being sworn in. And so there's examples from sort of both ways of thinking in the lives of these women. But one thing that became clear as we were sort of trying to distill, well, where do we go from here, and what can we learn from these women's lives, is that dealing and addressing childcare and taking it on so that it's not just the obligation of women as caregivers is a really important component of how we move forward and address enduring gender inequality. And it will be interesting to see how as we move through this new quarantine world we are living in the midst of COVID-19, where I think there is a new appreciation for what it means to be a caregiver, whether you're homeschooling children or taking care of someone who is ailing, either a child or an elderly parent. The real value of that work, and also how that obligation can compromise one's ability to move forward as quickly professionally if you're trying to juggle both of them. And it's not because someone isn't a competent, excellent professional. It's just because there's only so much time and energy in a day. And that definitely came through anyway in the lives of these women. And some of them, I think, especially thinking about Susie Sharp, I spent a lot of time in her personal papers, in her archives. And as much as her public persona was, I choose only my profession, it was very clear from her archives and her diaries that she had a lot of angst in that sacrifice. And I think one of the things that we take away from the book, we conclude with some strategies for moving forward. And I mentioned one, structural changes that don't burden those who have historically been excluded from positions of leadership and power. But another one of those lessons or strategies is, how can we allow individuals to live a whole life, even in the midst of pursuing positions of leadership and power?
Well, on the issue of changes, I want to ask you about the attitudes of men as part of what needs to change even more so, because you mentioned Carla Hills. This is the 1970s. This is not ancient history. And she was given a cabinet secretary position. She was considered for the Supreme Court, and yet some of the news articles about her refer to her having that Mary Tyler Moore smile.
Yes, and her brunette hair. Everyone wanted to talk about that.
Right. I don't remember them commenting on what color hair Samuel Alito had, or John Roberts, or anybody else. So whether you look at the way the media talks about men versus women, whether it's for the Supreme Court or for any position of leadership, or the way there's a focus on family or child issues. If a woman gets pregnant, all of a sudden, she would be looked at very differently than a man whose spouse is pregnant. So how and of course, when women have, first in very small numbers and then in increasing numbers, when they did find their way to a court bench or to an equity partner position, they experienced not being wanted in those positions by their male colleagues. Since we know that the numbers reflect still a long way to go to achieve greater access to those positions of leadership, those positions of authority, those positions of judicial decision making from the bench of a court. How do the attitudes of men need to change about these things? I mean, you mentioned the current pandemic that we're in, and maybe incidentally, that's something that could have an effect on attitudes. But what are some other ways, do you think, from having gone through the stories of all these women, do you think men's attitudes can be changed and need to be changed? How do we do that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that that's an important component. So, again, to go back to Florence Allen, who was the first woman to appear on a president's shortlist, at least that we know. When she went to the Sixth Circuit, it was reported in the media. So, of course, it took a man to believe in her, and a man whose attitude that I think had been very much influenced and shaped by his own wife. We all know that Eleanor Roosevelt had a very strong presence and valued opinion, and she was a valued advisor to her husband in that presidency. And she was also a real advocate for Florence Allen.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, you have one man believing in her ability, but it was reported in the papers that her fellow male colleagues on the Sixth Circuit, some of them had to take to bed. They were ill over the thought of a woman joining them on the bench. And then even once they recovered and were able to preside over cases with her, they still wouldn't let her come to lunch. So she was excluded from their lunches and had a hot plate that she would eat her lunch on. And when she retired from the court, she was still excluded from the lunches with the men after serving for many years with them. She was replaced by another woman who is in our group of shortlisted, Cornelia Kennedy. Cornelia Kennedy is from Michigan. And when she went onto the Sixth Circuit, Florence Allen handed off her hot plate to her. She was also excluded from those lunches. Eventually, though, those men's attitudes were changing, and they had been dining at a lunch club that banned women, and they told the club, you know what, we will not return unless you allow our colleague, Judge Kennedy, to join us. And of course, the club changed its policy. And so then she still kept her hot plate, though, on like a little marble pedestal. It's just a reminder, right? But that's that's a very, it's an anecdote, but it's an important one about the power of one man believing, right, that and being a validator for a woman, and then other men coming along. And that theme is echoed over and over again in the lives of each of the shortlisted women. And it's interesting. It was a similar dynamic on the U.S. Supreme Court. The justices did not want a woman to join the U.S. Supreme Court. That was definitely true when Nixon was at least floating women's names, and lots of conversations off the record and behind closed doors about how no one wanted to see a woman actually on the court at that time, even though it was being discussed. But by the time you get to President Reagan, who of course campaigned, he promised women, I'm going to put a woman on the Supreme Court. I think he did that because Carter had such a legacy of putting so many women into the federal judiciary, as we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. And so Reagan runs on that, and he fulfills it. And by then the court's ready, but in part because Justice Rehnquist was a law school classmate of Sandra Day O'Connor. In fact, was so fond of her that he proposed marriage at one point to her.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
So, yeah. And so, she ends up, she ends up moving to a court that at least had one, and I think probably more than one man who believed she belonged there. And it was evolving, changing, but I think we still have a similar sort of cultural dynamic where women are excluded, right? Sort of like that lunch club, right? And it's going to take those who are in the position of being on the inside, literally opening those doors over and over again. And I will say this, as we were finishing up the manuscript for this book, it was during the time when we were watching the Kavanaugh hearings, and so all of the sort of Me Too movement issues, and Dr. Ford's testimony was playing out, and it was really as the Me Too movement was coming to not just emerging, but really reaching a more mainstream audience, and there was press coverage of things like even Vice President Pence saying that he didn't feel comfortable having a meal alone with a female colleague, and we thought, gosh, that sounds an awful lot like the world that Florence Allen and Cornelia Kennedy and others were coming up in. And so I think that there is still this constant push-pull between cultural norms and having strong men, since they're in the dominant group, being willing to speak out against them to continue to help women along the way. And that's the real story. One of the neat sort of themes in this book is examples of exactly that. I
Well,
think the book can be. Oh, go ahead.
no, well, I was just going to say that that reminds me too about the debates about women in the military. The whole Pence. I can't be around women because I can only see them as potential sex objects. The fears men had about being in barracks or being on a battlefield with a woman. They can only see the woman not as a soldier, not as a colleague, not as a judge, but as for her sex. And that I think that's why Pence's attitude seems to so many of us so offensive and so backward thinking.
Yeah, and it's an attitude like that. We know that as someone is vying for a position of leadership and power, it often requires, and I wouldn't maybe always requires, a network of mentors and relationships, and a lot of that informal relationship building happens over meals or in what seems like a social setting, and limiting women only to the purely professional office life, which who knows what that means now in a world where no one's actually
True.
working in an office building. It has a real potential to be a setback. But what I was going to say is, part of what was fascinating to me about this project was how learning of these women's lives, they all became in different ways sort of mentors of sorts to me. It reminded me why it's so important to read biographies and autobiographies. Even if you don't have the ability to know someone one-on-one, you can often find mentorship in their stories. But it's not just a story that women need to be reading so that they can be inspired to carry forward, although there's a lot of inspiration to help fuel that. It's stories that men need to be reading, and anyone who is in the role of vetting and deciding and helping mentor and helping shape who the future of leadership is going to be. I think that
Mm-hmm.
we want to have a world where our leaders reflect the diversity of the public that they serve. And this book offers inspiration, whether you're someone who's vying to be on the short list and selected from it, or whether you're someone who's crafting that short list and deciding who comes off it.
Well, the other theme that I think really comes through in the book is you tell the stories of these women who rose to the positions that they rose to, whether they were on the short list and didn't make it, or were on the short list and they did make it. That one of the themes that comes through, and maybe this is how we can kind of wrap up, is we again recognize that this is an election year after all, and a very important election year, is the political power of women when they've exercised it, and when that political power has been recognized, has also been a pretty important determining factor. Going back to the first example, um, you know, uh, is Florence
Florence
Allen.
Allen.
She was able to get onto her first position on the bench through an election, which means there had to be people who voted for her, and there were, and women's groups, as you tell the story, did organize to support her election. Nixon privately didn't think women should be allowed into any position, but as you pointed out earlier, he wanted their votes. Reagan made a commitment to uh, to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, courting the women's vote in 1980. Even Joe Biden making a commitment to a female vice presidential running mate is obviously aware of the political weight of the women's vote, uh, as well as probably believing that's a good thing for him to do for other reasons. So, I mean, what would you say about? But because it can't just be men, sort of enlightened men opening doors and serving as mentors. I mean, it's also been about women demanding these things and lobbying for it and campaigning for these positions as well. That's had a tremendous influence over time.
No, that's absolutely right. And um, given the example of Florence Allen, we've talked about her. She demonstrates 100% the the power of women coming forward and voting. And another theme that is an example of women coming together, but a little bit different than the power of the vote, is one that we sort of coined as collaborating to compete. And so here's an example of what I mean by that. So one of the women we haven't talked about yet, who was shortlisted alongside O'Connor. So by the time we get to Reagan, he has a short list with lots of women on it, right? Or at least more women than we had ever seen before, which makes sense because he had promised to pick one. One of those women was a woman named Joan Dempsey Klein, a judge in California. And she was shortlisted, but then not the one selected. And I have to imagine that came with a lot of emotion, a real mix. And how does one react to something like that, to come so close and to not get it? And the way she channeled that energy was to champion Sandra Day O'Connors. She testified on her behalf at her Senate confirmation hearings. And so that's an example of coming together in order to compete and vie for these positions that you're absolutely right. Women haven't needed to wait for men just to come along and open the door. They can open the door themselves, and they can open the door for each other, and they should. And that's definitely a takeaway here. And it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward with these pledges for women to be in certain roles. So not only has Biden promised us a female for his vice president, but he also has promised to finally put an African-American woman on the Supreme Court. I very much hope he does. There's certainly a long list of women who would be qualified, minority women who would be qualified for the Supreme Court. And I really hope that his campaign promises are more than what Reagan's was. So to be sure, Reagan gave this country an extraordinary legacy in putting Sandra Day O'Connor on the court. But after that, he put very few women and minorities into the federal judiciary. And if the American public wasn't aware of how important who our judges are already, I think that they are increasingly becoming aware in that, Trump really made public the concept of what it means to be on a short list. In fact, he's the first president where you can actually go to whitehouse.gov and see his current short list for the Supreme Court. No other president had done that. Believe me, I spent, years combing through presidential archives trying to find these short lists. So he's made it very public and, as some would say, politicized or partisan. And what I would say about that is we have a heightened public awareness of how important not just who sits on the U.S. Supreme Court, but who fills out the entire federal judiciary. And so my hope is that if Biden becomes president, that he will not have just run on making women a priority for these two positions, but also that he will continue that legacy of looking for qualified female minority candidates to fill leadership roles throughout government.
Well, Renee, we didn't mention this in the beginning, but I feel we should. Renee holds the Joanne and Larry Doherty Chair in Legal Ethics and is professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. And she's the co-author, along with Hannah Brenner Johnson, of the new book, which I finished reading this morning before we started talking today. The book is called Shortlisted: Women in the Shadows of the Supreme Court and Coming Out of the Shadows. More and more, and hopefully more and more in the future, and not the distant future, the immediate future. So, Renee Knake Jefferson, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I know that you are quarantining and along with the rest of all of us, but you're in Texas. And I wish you a good health and staying safe. And thank you very much for being on the talk about this subject.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.